everyone, I'm Drew Goldfarb, joined by Taylor Smith. Today we are breaking down in a way too early preview the 2020 NBA Finals. All of the odds are out. They've actually been adjusted over the last few days. We are recording this just a few days after the Toronto Raptors won their very first NBA championship in franchise history. We had actually recorded a version of this shortly after it, the day after, in fact. But, let's start with the Lakers because that's why we're redoing this one, is because the Los Angeles Lakers, who were already the betting favorites at the Westgate at plus 450, traded for Anthony Davis and are now a by far betting favorite, the odds-on favorites at plus 300. So, Taylor, let's just start with the Lakers. We were both a little confused a week ago when we were talking about it, and we were going over why the Lakers would be so favored when they hadn't yet done anything. They've done something. Should they be the betting favorites?
That's really tough. We thought at the time that they were favored just because of the potential for them to make a move like this, and one day later, they did. It's really hard to say because Golden State, everyone thinks is, they're going to be hobbled. They might not have Durant back or Klay Thompson back. Those guys might not even be on the roster. So, I don't buy into them. The Raptors are a wild card because we don't know where Kawhi's going, if he's staying. The Rockets have not been able to get over the hump. The Clippers are at plus 700. They shouldn't be that high. They should also not be the favorites at all. I think it would be fair to say Milwaukee should be the favorite just based on last season. They had the best record in the league. They're expected to change their roster less than some of these other teams. So, I get why the Lakers are the favorites. They have LeBron. They now have Anthony Davis. They're likely to add at least one more star caliber player, depending on how the salary cap situation shakes out. I think there's a lot of public bias in these odds just because they're the Lakers. People like to bet on the Lakers. Vegas is close to LA. A lot of Angelinos travel over there and want to throw their money down on their favorite team. So their odds are always a little bit lower than they should be. So I can see why they're the favorites. It makes a lot more sense today than it did on Friday, but plus 300 is still not great value on a team that didn't even make the playoffs last season. So, there's a lot here to discuss.
Yeah, those plus 450 odds that they had when we sat down and tried to do this on Friday now would be at least much more reasonable. But still to have them, a team that did not make the playoffs a year ago, as you said, brand new head coach. They fired Magic Johnson as well. They've started to make changes. It's, LeBron James, when he got hurt midway through the season, December, I want to say last year, and they were in an okay spot up until that point, and then it was just a disaster. So there's potential with this team, but to go from missing the playoffs to the betting favorites to win the NBA championship before they got Anthony Davis was insane. After getting Anthony Davis, it's still weird. I still think that there's absolutely no betting value to them because a 3-1 payoff for a team that is completely unproven, that's a bet to me that there's so many red flags because they could play and LeBron and Anthony Davis could just not work well together. It's entirely possible. Or if you get like a situation where Golden State can, if Stephen Curry can keep things okay for them where they'd make the playoffs and then Klay Thompson comes back, or if they were to also re-sign Durant and they were to get them, the two of them back for a matchup with the Lakers in the playoffs, who are you taking? So, the proven team that's been in the NBA Finals basically every year forever, or the team that made a move. So I think it's interesting. I think, though, that LA bias also shows when you're looking at the second highest favored team in the Western Conference, that being the Clippers, who did fall from plus 600 on Friday to plus 700 after the Anthony Davis trade, because they are considered to be one of the potential landing spots for Kawhi Leonard, since Leonard is an LA native. That one, again, the Clippers now, as we're sitting here recording this, and who knows by the time this gets posted or by the time someone's watching this, but Now the Clippers are in the position the Lakers were in on Friday, where I don't know what they've done. Yeah, they beat Golden State a couple times in the first round, but they were an 8 seed and knocked out as an 8 seed.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like their entire offseason and their championship odds completely hinge on Kawhi Leonard. Because if they don't get him, then what? Jimmy Butler's out there, but Jimmy Butler on the Clippers doesn't make them a championship favorite, as good as he is. Kyrie Irving, same thing. There's no transformative player out there now that Durant is likely off the table as far as next season. It's Kawhi or bust. So I just don't think it's likely enough to where the 600 odds make them a viable bet. At this point, I still think Kawhi is probably staying where he is, but we'll obviously see. But even then, even if they do get Kawhi, it's Kawhi with Danilo Gallinari and Montrezl Harrell. It's a decent team, but does that make them better than Houston? Does that make them better than the Lakers, potentially, the Golden State Warriors, Denver Nuggets, even in their own conference? I mean, we saw what Kawhi can do, how transformative he can be, but it's certainly not a guarantee that even if he does join the Clippers, they vault into the top tier of contenders. So, that's just something I wouldn't bet on either, because if they don't get Kawhi, you're looking at a team that snuck into the playoffs basically last season in the tougher conference without a star player still. So, I wouldn't be betting on them either. That just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I mean, even adding Kawhi Leonard, they may not be the best team in their building, which is, I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. Is they could still be they would still be the second best team in LA, and the odds do reflect that. But you're still, I mean, anyway, yeah. And if you're gonna go with a Kawhi Leonard bet, I would much rather take the Raptors plus 1,000 with the potential of him resigning. Just for the record, we're recording this during the Toronto Raptors parade. So in the event that he made some announcement during the parade, so we don't have to record this a third time, if Kawhi Leonard has announced during the parade that he's staying in Toronto, okay, the Raptors are probably now the betting favorites. They're probably moved up a bit, at the very least probably tied with the Bucks, who are Milwaukee plus 600. But if he hasn't, and if you're watching this and Kawhi Leonard has not yet arrived to a decision as to where he's going to play for 2019-2020, the Raptors, for me, are the much more interesting bet at plus 1,000 than the Clippers now at plus 700, especially when they were plus 600 on Friday. Because it's been proven that the Raptors can win an NBA title if Kawhi Leonard's in the lineup. And they would essentially have the same team next year as they did this year. It's 2 signings away from having the same roster, Leonard being the bigger of the two. So if he decides to stay in Toronto, the Raptors are the much more interesting play at this point at plus 1,000 than the Clippers hoping to get Leonard at plus 700, especially given that they're an Eastern Conference team.
And they have the advantage, they can offer more money and one more year than any other team, which has to be at least a little alluring if you're Kawhi Leonard. And like you said, easier conference in theory, especially at the bottom. You're talking about Orlando sneaking into the playoffs last year, teams like that. So, an Eastern Conference Finals berth isn't a guarantee, but it's pretty likely, especially if a team like Boston, which may lose Kyrie Irving and whatever else, if they take a step back, then you're talking about Milwaukee, Toronto, Philadelphia, and then a huge gap between the top and the second tier in that conference alone. So like you said, I saw over the weekend Marc Gasol, who can opt out, and Danny Green, who will be a free agent, both said basically that their decision to stay in Toronto depends on Kawhi Leonard. So if Kawhi decides to stay and they keep those guys as a result, then there's no reason to think they shouldn't be the favorites really to repeat. They got a little lucky with that bounce in Game 7 against Philly, but we saw against the best team in the league, the Bucks, and the reigning dynasty, the Warriors, that this team is capable of beating anybody, assuming they have the same roster next year. There's always potential for a championship hangover. We saw it, for example, like the Cubs a couple of years ago. The Red Sox so far this season haven't been quite as good. So, maybe the drive wouldn't be there for Toronto, but just based on the talent, the coaching staff, everything they have going for them, plus 1,000 for the reigning champions, assuming they can retain pretty much the same roster, is excellent value.
But in the Eastern Conference too, if you have that little bit of a hangover and you're still a good team, you're a top 4 seed. So, yeah, I mean, and if you're a top 4 seed in the East, you should basically, it's almost a pass to the second round. It's close enough. I mean, if you're the number 1 seed and you look at Milwaukee, I don't even know that they were really. You had like an analyst who it was Paul Pierce, wasn't it? Who was like, "Oh, the Bucks are done after Game 1 of their series." Right. But if you're not forgetting that, if you're not Paul Pierce, who has that great connection to the Celtics, the Bucks weren't really challenged for the first 2 rounds. So if you get that top seed in the Eastern Conference, it's a cakewalk in the first round. And it's not a cakewalk, but it's close in the second round. I mean, and realistically, all the Raptors have to do is make the playoffs, and then they'll make it to the second round. So yeah, at plus 1,000, I like those odds better because I think that even if you think it's a 50-50 toss-up that Leonard were to stay with Toronto or go specifically to the Clippers, which I would say that it's probably not exactly 50-50, and there's probably going to be a couple of other teams to sneak in on the 50 side that he leaves. Plus 1,000 odds for a team that's won with him and plays in the Eastern Conference is much better than plus 700 odds for a team that plays in LA, is not the Lakers, and has to deal with the West. You'd brought up Boston. The Celtics were plus 1,200 odds before the Anthony Davis trade to LA. They're now plus 1,600. It had come out that Anthony Davis had said repeatedly, publicly and privately, that he would not re-sign with the Celtics if they had traded for him. They did not trade for him. Their odds have dropped. They were tied with the Sixers at plus 1,200. They're now plus 1,600, which puts them in the company of the Denver Nuggets. So do you think that the Celtics are now, they're obviously, I would think their odds are certainly worse that they would win the NBA championship in 2020 than it was before Davis was traded. Do you think, though, that they might still be worth a gander at plus 1,600 odds with Davis off the table, or are they just a move on to the next?
I wouldn't write them off completely. They were kind of a disaster this past season. They were expected to be the team in the Eastern Conference. They were not in the end. But the whole potential for them to trade for Anthony Davis, I think the plus 1,200 odds reflected that. Now that that's off the table, it's understandable that they've dropped a little bit. And they're pretty likely, it seems, to lose Kyrie Irving. But I think you can make at least part of an argument that says that they're better without him. He's been hurt a lot over the last couple of years. They fared pretty well without him. They almost made the finals without him last season, 2 seasons ago, I guess now. So, even if they lose Irving, I don't think they're dead. They've played well without him, but it's really tough at those odds just based on how they performed last season. But I think it's still viable. Plus 1,600 is pretty favorable. Boston's one of those teams. Who's to say if they lose Irving, they can't sign someone else, potentially Kemba Walker. I doubt that happens, but at least it's possible. So I wouldn't write them off completely. I like them obviously better at plus 1,600 than plus 1,200, but, they still play in the Eastern Conference. They can still pretty much not guarantee, but I think they're pretty close to a second round lock, at least if they get a top 4 seed, even without Irving. So I don't hate that. Injuries can affect a lot. Who's to say Kawhi Leonard doesn't tear his ACL next season and then it's wide open. So I think you can always bet on a team like Boston at plus 1,600. They still have a good amount of talent left over, even without Irving. So I don't hate it. It's not my favorite bet. I would not bet them over a team like Toronto or Philly, but if you want to take a flyer, I can see it.
Yeah, I think Boston becomes a more intriguing play if Leonard signs outside of the Eastern Conference. If he decides to go out west, if he does go to like the Clippers or another Western Conference team, then the Celtics at plus 1,600 are more intriguing. But as you just mentioned, the team that is much more interesting to me, and we were talking about this on Friday when they were the same odds, is the Sixers at plus 1,200, because they were, as you mentioned, a bounce away from, well, at the very least going to overtime in Game 7 against the team that ended up winning the NBA championship in the Eastern Conference semis. They are an incredibly talented team when they are all together and they're all healthy, which are always question marks, especially with the way that roster is currently sitting. But the Sixers are, I think, kind of like Toronto, are an interesting play, especially because if Leonard leaves, plus 1,200 odds on the Sixers suddenly becomes plus 1,200 odds on the second best team in the Eastern Conference. I would say, at least to the Bucks, at plus 600. Are the Sixers still the team that you kind of see being maybe that better pick if you're not going to bet on like a favorite this far out that might end up paying off in the long run?
Yeah, if you're looking at the teams that are plus 1,200 or higher, I think they're pretty easily the best option. They have question marks of their own. Jimmy Butler, Tobias Harris are both free agents. It's no guarantee that they keep either of them, but I think at this point, it's more likely that they keep both than it is that they lose one of them. So assuming they run back pretty much the same team we saw last season, they had just traded for Butler and Harris last season. They never really had time to gel. They didn't have an offseason together, training camp, things like that. And they still almost beat the team that almost won, or that did win the title. So if they have that continuity, they can work together for a full offseason, things like that. I think that only helps them. They have the talent, like you said. Joel Embiid, that's probably the best center in the league. Ben Simmons is going to be a third-year player. Jimmy Butler's still a star. We saw in the playoffs, he pretty much carried them in that series. Tobias Harris, if he's your fourth option, you're in pretty good shape. Depth is a concern. Their bench was pretty horrible last season, but at plus 1,200, that's a team that, like you said, would probably be the second favorite in the East behind Milwaukee if Kawhi leaves, third favorite if he stays. Again, that's pretty much a free ticket to the second round, assuming Joel Embiid doesn't crumble into 1,000 pieces. But plus 1,200 for a team like that is also excellent value. So among the long shots, I think they'd be my favorite.
Yeah, and as long as Embiid, if he crumbles into 100 pieces or less, I still think they get to the second round. That 1,000 pieces I think that's the cutoff where you might get upset by a team like the Magic. But one of the long shots, I just want to mention this before we go back to the Western Conference, because we were talking about the Anthony Davis trade and the impact it had on teams like the odds for the Lakers and Boston, where Boston dropped from plus 1,200 to plus 1,600, and the sky is falling when you think that. But if you were ever thinking that your team had, the sky is falling situation, you can always look to the Knicks to feel better. Because unless your team is the Knicks, in which case, geez, I'm sorry. But the Knicks were plus 2,000 odds, a team that was the worst in the NBA a year ago. They were only plus 2,000, which put them at 10 times better odds at winning the NBA Finals than some of the teams that are at the very bottom. They are now, after Anthony Davis is off the table, plus 5,000 odds. This has been a disaster of an offseason for the New York Knicks, and no free agents have signed yet. The NBA draft hasn't happened yet, and this is already a complete and utter failure disaster for the Knicks, because the free agent that they were going to go after is out until probably April, May of next year in Kevin Durant, at least the one they were always tied to going after. The player they were going to try to trade for, Anthony Davis, was traded to the Lakers, and the first overall pick went to the New Orleans Pelicans in the NBA draft lottery. So they are 0 for 3. They have, they've struck out. They're going for the golden sombrero with a fourth strikeout at some point. I don't want to rail on them too much, but I guess that's what we're doing since we're bringing up the Knicks in a 2020 NBA Finals prediction way too early preview. But is there anything that the Knicks could possibly do, conceivably, realistically do at this point to let's set the standard low to be a playoff team, to be a 500 team in the Eastern Conference this year?
Man, I think so, just because the East is so bad. Orlando is one of the lower seeds. They could lose their best player. Nikola Vucevic is a free agent. If that happens, I imagine they take a step back. And there is still at least a chance that the Knicks sign Kyrie This was another big rumor during the season that, Kyrie and KD are going to link up in New York. And now it sounds like Kyrie's kind of leaning toward Brooklyn, which is kind of another stab through the heart for the Knicks. If he joins the other team in the same town that doesn't have the decorated history that they do. But the Nets are a better team right now. They have competent management, so I wouldn't blame Kyrie for picking them over the Knicks. I don't think anyone with a right mind would. But if the Knicks manage to get Kyrie, I think that obviously helps them in the short term. I think they can sneak into the playoffs just because the East is so weak at the bottom. But, even if they sign Durant, he's not playing next year probably. They're not winning the title with no Durant, even if they get Durant and Kyrie. At the earliest, their most reasonable championship path would be 2021. So obviously we're not talking about that. So no, I don't think that's a viable bet at all. It was never viable, even when they were plus 2,000. So plus 5,000, I think that's still too favorable for them. They're ahead of the Spurs, or they're tied with the Spurs.
They find themselves ahead of the Spurs, the Pacers. The Pelicans didn't actually move, which I thought was funny. They're still plus 6,000 because I just figure the sports books assumed Anthony Davis was not a member of the Pelicans. The Magic are now at plus 8,000. The Hawks plus 8,000. I mean, these are all teams aside from maybe New Orleans that I would take over the Knicks. The Nets one is interesting because they're plus 2,500 to win the NBA championship. I still would think, though, that the Eastern Conference, just with like I don't know if that, even if they were to get a player like Kyrie, if that would be enough. They do also have some, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, they do have some pretty decent positions in the first round of the draft this year, if I'm not confusing them with another team. So they might have the potential to be that, to break into the top 4, even if they were to get a guy like Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, I think that's a little interesting. That was a good team last year. If they theoretically replaced D'Angelo Russell with Kyrie Irving, I think that's an upgrade. I'm not the biggest Kyrie fan. I don't know if he's a guy that's going to lead a team to a title. If he's the best player, obviously he's won a title, but they had LeBron. So Brooklyn plus 2,500, I do think that's okay value. It's just hard to see, Kyrie plus. They have a bunch of good role players, guys like Dinwiddie and Jared Allen. But I just don't think that's a championship roster, even in the East.
Does all the uncertainty for the Eastern Conference teams, because even with Toronto, with Philadelphia, with the Nets, and the Celtics, I think those are teams 2 through 5, as far as the favorites. Does that basically mean that the Bucks, who are plus 600, the second most heavily favored team to win the NBA championship, does that basically mean that they are safe as a prediction? Or do you think that basically the volatility means that you're better off taking one of the other teams and betting on them having a good offseason? Are you better off basically taking Toronto and banking on Kawhi Leonard returning and that team staying intact? Or taking a team like, if you're a big believer in the Nets or the Celtics, being able to make those moves? Or is it just, the Bucks are plus 600. They were the best team in the NBA in the regular season last year. They basically ran into Toronto on their way to an NBA Finals matchup with the Golden State Warriors, and basically fell apart after their first game in Toronto. So are the Bucks just everybody else seems to have something going on, but the Bucks might be a more reasonable team. Or at the very least, they're the most solidified in their positioning, I would think.
They're the most predictable team among those teams, just because we know they have Giannis. We know they have Eric Bledsoe locked up. They do still have some uncertainty. Chris Middleton can be a free agent this summer. Brook Lopez and Nikola Mirotic will be, and Malcolm Brogdon. So, they're not a lock to be the same team they were last season, but I think most people think they're going to bring back the key guys. I think Middleton is very unlikely to leave. I doubt they let Brogdon go. Brook Lopez was a great signing for them. I can't believe the Lakers let him go to sign JaVale McGee instead. That's a whole other discussion. But I think I'd still be more willing to take a team like Toronto or Philly at plus 1,000 and plus 1,200 over the Bucks, just because it's not a lock that they're the same team, and they're the Bucks. They don't really have a long track record of success. They were great this season. Mike Budenholzer looks like a perfect fit, but they're not a lock to be the same great team they were this past season. Who knows how that collapse affects them moving forward, if at all. Plus 600 for a team like that with a no pedigree really is a little bit low for me. I would prefer them at plus 1,000 or higher, obviously. So I think if I'm betting on something like this, which is pretty unpredictable to begin with, especially with the Warriors down and out, basically, I'd be more willing to take a chance on a team with more profit potential. So I don't love the Bucks at plus 600. I think they're viable, but I would just go for the longer bets there.
That makes sense. And you mentioned Golden State. So moving back to the West, because we've already gone over the two LA teams. They are 1 and 2, the Lakers and Clippers, as far as favorites to win the NBA out of the West. The fourth team in the Western Conference is Golden State, who somehow jumped from plus 1,400 odds on Friday to plus 1,200 odds after the trade was made with Anthony Davis going to the Lakers. They're a team that is interesting because they still have Stephen Curry. And if they make the playoffs and they've got Klay Thompson and he comes back and can return going into the playoff run, and especially if they were able to bring back Kevin Durant and he were able to return for the playoff run, at least maybe for the second round or beyond, they become intriguing again. It's kind of interesting to see the Warriors with those long odds, but that's because of their track record. The team that is going to be playing for at least 60, 75% of the 2019-2020 regular season is not going to be anything like the team we've seen in the past. Does that make it intriguing for you because of the odds that they now have in case they're able to re-sign Durant and basically get to the playoffs with just Curry and then bring back essentially make two giant trade deadline acquisitions? Or do you move away from them because you go, they lost to the Raptors, the shine is off, and they may lose 2/3 of what made them so dominant?
It's really tough. It's weird that they jumped because it seems like their conference got tougher with that trade. So I don't really understand that. Unless odds makers are more confident 3 days later that they're going to keep Durant and Klay Thompson. But we've seen, as far as I know, there's been nothing public. I think Klay Thompson's dad said he expects him to stay, but I think most people expected Klay Thompson to stay anyway. Durant has been the real wild card here. I don't like it. Even if they do come back next season, late in the season, I imagine they'll be limited. I mean, Durant's injury in particular is just something you don't come back from quickly. We saw DeMarcus Cousins do it. It took him about a full year to come back, and even then, he wasn't playing 30 minutes a game until like April. And in the playoffs, DeMarcus Cousins is different than Kevin Durant, but he wasn't the same player we saw before necessarily. So even if they get Durant back, are they going to win a title with Durant playing 25 to 30 minutes a game in the playoffs? And then you have Klay Thompson. And the team struggled with depth to begin with. If they keep Durant and Thompson, they still have no money to spend on role players. So a lack of depth and two guys coming off serious injury like that, I just don't like it, especially in the tougher conference. Denver, Portland, Houston, the Lakers, the Clippers, there's the Thunder. It's just too tough. I think plus 1,200 is not favorable enough given all the question marks with them. So I would just wait for those odds to either come down or, if we get some clarity on a potential timetable for return on either of those guys. But I don't see it right now. They were competitive against the Raptors in the finals without those two for a while, but over the course of a full season and another playoff run, it's just hard to see how they get through.
Yeah, and I also think I kind of agree, to build on one of your points, I think it's likely that of these teams that are in the top handful, the Warriors are the most likely ones to have better odds once the season gets going. If they get off to that weak start, assuming it's just Steph Curry, if they get off to a 500 start, their odds are more likely to increase, but still provide the same basic betting potential. Or at the very least, I don't know that line really moves that much, because they're not going to, unless Stephen Curry is able to lead that team to a 20-10 start. I don't know that by the time January rolls around that they aren't sitting at least in a similar kind of position. And at that point, you can wait, and even if it's a little bit worse, even if you're getting them at plus 800, plus 1200, or plus 1,000, to know that they've got Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant on the roster, which is really the only way that it would make sense to bet on them anyway. To know that they are building back to having those guys return in March or April or whatever, I think would be worth whatever odds change you might get at that point. You mentioned the Rockets. They ran into the Golden State Warriors again. I know that this is opening up a scar and another wound for you, but they are now the third most favored team in the West, behind the two teams in LA. They're at plus 800, which I think we would agree makes them a better play in this exact moment than the Clippers at plus 700. Whether or not a signing would change that, though, I guess is where we go from here. The Rockets have been that team that is always on the cusp and has always run into somebody. And just when the Warriors seem like they were gonna lose Durant, and they lost him to injury, and have lost Klay Thompson injury, now the Lakers have added Anthony Davis, and it's still just a couple of days. The Raptors, like I said, as we're sitting here, the Raptors are still holding their championship parade. So basically, are the Raptors one of those teams that kind of gets stuck, where history will remember them as a team that was always like the good one that ran into a team like Jordan's Bulls, where they were just never going to be the best team in their conference? Or are they in a position where, now that the Warriors dynasty might be closing or actually over, at plus 800, are they now an intriguing play? Is this the year they might be able to actually get over that hump?
I think they can. I mean, 2 years ago, it's easy to forget, but they were the best team in the league. They had the best record in the NBA. They were the number 1 seed. They came to within a Chris Paul hamstring, I think, of being in the finals and probably beating Cleveland that year. So, they still have the same guys. They still have James Harden. They still have an aging Chris Paul. Clint Capella's still there. There was talk before Durant and Thompson got hurt that the Rockets might try to blow it up. And Paul, everyone on the roster is available except Harden, basically. But I wonder if these injuries now open the door for them to run it back next season. Mike D'Antoni's coming back. I think they're a viable bet. They got off to a slow start last season, which caused them to, I think, finish as the 5 seed, which set up a second round series with Golden State, or 4 seed, I think. So, but they rebounded. They were pretty easily the second best team in the conference, I think, still by the time the playoffs rolled around. The Lakers, like we were saying, there's still a lot left to be determined with them. The Clippers, as we said, are very unproven right now. So I think it's pretty viable at plus 800, assuming it's the same team with the same drive. And if Chris Paul doesn't have some horribly timed injury in the playoffs, as always seems to be the case, I think there's merit to taking them, just because they're proven. Golden State's really the only team they haven't been able to beat. They should, in theory, be able to beat them now. I don't think the Lakers stack up, even as presently constructed, necessarily. We'll see how that goes, but I would be much more willing to take the Rockets at plus 800 than LA at plus 300, or plus 700 for the other one.
There are a lot of teams in the West that kind of fall into a range, plus 1,600 to plus 3,000, that all have either recently been, including this past season, a contender, or as close as you were going to get in a conference with Golden State and Houston, or getting close in there. The Nuggets are plus 1,600. The Thunder plus 2,000 now. They've dropped since the Anthony Davis trade. The Jazz and Blazers each dropped a bit also over the weekend. They're now plus 3,000. The Blazers, were in the Western Conference Finals this year. You got the Mavericks at plus 4,000. The Spurs now plus 6,000. Kind of puts them in kind of the edge of, even being remotely relevant. But Is there any one of those teams that jumps out at you as a potential play? I mean, the Blazers were, they got swept, but they were a conference finalist, and they're at plus 3,000 odds. The Nuggets at plus 1,600 were a team that, I think some people thought were going to be conference finalists last year too. Is there any in that group that might actually be worth a play to you, or is the Western Conference much more of, is it a deep conference, but you're still better off sticking with those teams that should hold the top seeds?
I mean, it's just really tough with this too, because it all really comes back to Golden State and the Lakers. If Golden State drops off, obviously a spot opens up, but are the Lakers just sliding into that spot? That's what odds makers think. We don't really believe it, but I think of those teams, Denver makes the most sense. I think you said plus 1,600. They were the number 2 seed. They weren't great in the playoffs. The Spurs took them to 7. They lost to Portland in 7 in the second round, but they were the second best team in the West. They were the top seed for a while until Golden State kind of surged late in the year. Nikola Jokic is a legit superstar. They have a good roster of young talent around him. I think they're a well-coached team. I don't know what they do this offseason. I have no idea if they have the potential to get someone like a Jimmy Butler in there, Tobias Harris, something like that. I think Jokic could use a secondary option. I think Jamal Murray might be that guy, but we don't know yet with him. So of the teams in the long-ish shot range in the West, I think Denver makes the most sense. OKC, that's a team in theory that should be good, but always seems to kind of flounder in the playoffs. Russell Westbrook, I think, is a pretty overrated superstar at this point. Portland, I think, benefited from an easier road. They had OKC in round 1, Denver round 2. I don't think they would have made the Western Conference Finals if they'd had to go through Houston necessarily, but it's not a horrible play at plus 3,000. I like Utah a little bit more. I think that roster as a whole is a little bit better than Portland's. I think Portland's kind of top heavy with Lillard and McCollum, and who knows what's up with Yusuf Nurkic right now. But I'm not loving any of those teams as far as winning the title. I think if I were to take a shot, it'd be Denver. But, Denver at plus 1,600 in the tougher conference, or Philly at plus 1,200 in the easier conference, I would just take Philly. So I don't love any of them. Denver would be the one if I had to pick, but I would throw like $5 at the most on it.
I would agree with you. I might like the Nuggets a bit more than you would, just because they, in addition to being the best team for a lot of the year in the Western Conference last year, which with Golden State's injuries makes them the best returning team because they're them being proven. The Lakers may very well storm their way to the number 1 seed or something to that extent, but they've got question marks, whereas the Nuggets just have to be what they were last year. They were also the best team at home in the NBA until the playoffs started. But they were a very good team. They were nearly unbeatable in Denver. They are, I kind of do, I agree with you too on we do see eye to eye in the Eastern Conference, where the Sixers are that team that if you're looking to make a play, they were so close to upsetting the Raptors in the conference semis last year. And if the Raptors were able to, beat Milwaukee, could Philly do the same? I think that the Nuggets would be my play of those like mid-long shots, the mid-range shots, I guess, from the Western Conference. I do like them a lot better than the Thunder. Jazz and Blazers are interesting, but they wouldn't be interesting if they weren't at 30-1. The Nuggets at 16-1, I think, have the potential where if they look at last year and they go and they just kind of like grind down and they end up being the same team in the regular season, and then the regular season team becomes their playoff team, they very well could win the Western Conference. And there are fewer question marks for them, I think, than at least any of the Western Conference teams ahead of them. There's fewer question marks for the Nuggets than there are for the Warriors, fewer than for Houston, way fewer than there are for the Clippers, and there are still fewer than there are for the Lakers, even though the Lakers have added Anthony Davis, because they're yet to play together. So I do think that the Nuggets might provide some decent odds, some decent value at plus 1,600. I don't know that they necessarily win the NBA championship and pay off on that bet, but I do think that if you're looking for something with few question marks and a potential payout, the Nuggets might be the best option for that. Still don't know that they're going to win, but they have few question marks. They're, like I said, fewer than anybody else in the West.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that Michael Porter, who was the #1 high school player in the country coming out of high school, he missed all this season with an injury, but they got him with the 14th pick last year. If he's a star player, like people thought he would be out of high school, there's a chance that Denver's adding a legit star level talent. Obviously, the injuries with him are red flags. He's had back problems, but if he's the player he could be, then that's just one more star on a team with a ton of good young talent. So you're kind of talking me into Denver a little bit. I really do like that, but it's just tough. There are a lot of teams at the top that just kind of stack up a little better. But as far as value goes, I think they're probably the best bet on the board right there with Philly.
Yeah, like I said, and that's a good question mark to have, because that's not a what he can do or not do. They were fine without him. So that's a good question mark to have. Whereas like the Lakers, Clippers are coming off of terrible seasons where they added, where at least the Lakers have added a big piece. The Clippers are hoping to add a big piece. All of their question marks are they going to be the team that they could be on paper, or are they going to be awful like they were a year ago? So it's a better question mark to have for the Nuggets. That's actually like a plus to have that question mark. So, yeah, I'm gonna, I guess, stop at the sales pitch, because if I'm already talking you into it, basically, my job's done. I'm just gonna,
It's a bet that has a floor, whereas the Clippers and Lakers don't really have a floor. Like, we don't know what they are. We know what the Nuggets are, theoretically. So, assuming they're healthy, that just makes more sense than a team like the Clippers.
So I would wrap up by asking if you're gonna pick someone who is not a Lakers-Bucks series, which are the two favorites for each of the conferences, which teams you would pick. But I think that we're now both on the same page, or we were even before that. But if you're picking some of those teams that are in that middle range, I would go from the East, Philly. I think they've got a really good ceiling, and especially with the uncertainty attached to Toronto. I'm between those two. It kind of depends on if you think Kawhi Leonard's going to re-sign in Toronto. That I think the Raptors are probably the best at plus 1,000 are going to be very good odds, because they'll jump dramatically as soon as he re-signs. But I'd go with the Nuggets in the West. I like the Sixers as a play in the East. I really like them going in the playoffs last year, and then they ran into Canada's just destiny team with the Raptors. Are you on the same boat? Do you see something as a different thing? Assuming you can't go Lakers Bucks, because what's the fun in picking the favorites?
Yeah, I think it's down to Philly, Toronto. I think that's pretty clearly, those are the two options. If you can't pick Milwaukee in the East, I don't really see anyone else that's viable. Among the Western teams, I think the Rockets, I would take the Rockets over Denver, even at half as favorable odds, plus 800, just because, over the last few years, the Rockets have just owned the Nuggets. Assuming the Rockets stay the same with Harden in there, Chris Paul, etc., I just think they're more likely to make a deep playoff run than Denver. I think Denver is just super young. This experience from this season will help, but it's still just a really young roster in general. I'm not sold that next season they're going to suddenly have what it takes to go all the way. I would trust Houston more in a playoff run than Denver. So the odds aren't as good, but plus 800 is still pretty favorable. I would take Houston in the West, but Denver, as we've said, is increasingly interesting, at least.
Well, I guess I'm going to continue my sales pitch in a second, but that is going to wrap it up for us here. I'm Drew Goldfarb, he's Taylor Smith. Let us know in the comments below who you think stands the best chance to win the 2020 NBA championship. And also let us know if any of those players have signed by the time you're actually watching this video. Just keep that in mind when you're looking at our picks. The only movement that we've seen so far is Anthony Davis to the Lakers. He's Taylor Smith. I'm Drew Goldfarb. Like, share, and subscribe to the Odds On Favorites YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.